Okay, hello everyone. I see folks filing in. Welcome, welcome. Very excited to have you here. So we've had a little glitch in the matrix. So first order of business, please rename yourselves so we know who's here. And you can do that by hovering over your name, clicking the more button, and then you can rename yourself by pressing that button. But anyway, let's go ahead and get started. This is so exciting. So welcome. My name is Catherine Hecht. I'm the executive director of the Alexander Valley Film Society. I'm thrilled to have a very special guest with us in the studio tonight to give us a lecture on some really incredible history and goings on in his life. Before we get started and before I make that introduction, I do want to start with our land acknowledgement. So the Alexander Valley Film Society, AVFS, recognizes that we are on unceded lands of the Coast Miwok, Pomo, and Wapo. We respectfully acknowledge the Indigenous people who have lived here for thousands of years and who continue to contribute in meaningful ways to their communities and our society as a whole. Our shared history includes the genocide, forced removal, and ethnic cleansing of Indigenous people. AVFS is committed to centering Indigenous voices and stories to recognize the past and celebrate the resiliency of Native people and their culture. Our deepest thanks go to Nikki Myers Lim and the California Indian Museum, as well as Clint McKay from Pepperwood Preserve for their assistance in this acknowledgement. And to learn more, you can go to our website, avfilmsociety.org/equity. Okay, so before we get started, just remember we've disabled videos and not allowed anybody to unmute so we can keep the pristine nature of the lecture tonight. Drop all of your questions into the chat feature. Tess is going to be moderating. Tess from the Film Society will be moderating, and when we have time for questions at the end, she will call you by name and then read out your question. Also, this evening is brought to you free by the generosity of our sponsors and donors at the Film Society. So if you are so compelled, a suggested donation of $10 or more would be more than welcome through our website at avfilmsociety.org/donate. Okay, so without further ado, it is my immense pleasure to welcome the internationally renowned film historian, author and editor of 22 books, biographer, professor of cinema at San Francisco State University, and actor for Orson Welles in The Other Side of the Wind as a film historian, Joseph McBride. Joseph, welcome.
Thank you, Catherine and Tess. It's really wonderful of you to have me. I really appreciate it. And your members and the people from throughout the country and the world. I recognize some names of friends and people I don't know, and it's just wonderful to be talking to everybody. Tess was a student of mine at San Francisco State in screenwriting, and it's really a pleasure to see students doing well and helping to bring classic films and discussions to the world, and I really think it's great. And in this time of COVID, I've been doing a number of these webinars and podcasts, and it's a good way of chatting with people around the country and the world, and talking about films. And I think hopefully we'll continue that even after we get back together in person. But today I thought I'd talk about biographies. I'm known as a film biographer to some extent, but I've written a lot of other kinds of books, and I want to talk about. Sometimes there are a lot of misunderstandings in the field of biographies that I hope to clear up. I've written really 4 biographies of movie directors. Frank Capra, The Catastrophe of Success, in '92, and that took 7.5 years, four years of which were consumed with the legal struggle to get the book out. And then I did a book called Frankly Unmasking Frank Capra, which came out last year, which was a 500-page book about the legal struggle to get the first book out. And it's also about the making of a complicated book. Biographies are many moving parts and many interesting experiences. And Frankly is kind of a Kafkaesque tale, but has a happy ending, like a Capra movie. I also did a biography of John Ford, my favorite director, Searching for John Ford, and Steven Spielberg, a biography, who I think he's the greatest current director. And I've done, I did a memoir slash critical study of Orson Welles called Whatever Happened to Orson Welles, A Portrait of an Independent Career, which is an unusual book. It's a critical study covering his whole life from sort of a fresh perspective of looking back from his later years, which people understand the least because he was working in kind of obscurity because the media don't cover independent experimental filmmakers very well. So I thought I'd illuminate that, but to help you understand why he became an independent filmmaker totally, I mean, making literally home movies in later years, I realized he'd been independent throughout his life, which was an insight I got from my friend Douglas Gomery, who's a well-known film scholar I went to college with. Even when Welles was working for major studios, he functioned as an independent. That was part of the problem he ran into, that he was not a guy who worked on an assembly line, as he said very well. But that's why we like him. And when I was younger, I did critical studies of Welles and John Ford with Michael Willington. I did the Ford book. And now I've gone back to writing critical studies, and I'll explain why. I wrote How Did Lubitsch Do It? About Ernst Lubitsch, the great German-American director, and came out in 2018 from Columbia University Press. And I thought, you know, I'm at the stage of my life where I just want to have fun writing, and can't have more fun than writing about Ernst Lubitsch. I mean, he's such a wonderful director, and he was somewhat neglected, but he's having a comeback. And then I just finished, or I'm still working on the final stages of a critical study of Billy Wilder, another one of my favorite directors. I've been writing about him for over 50 years now, and that's kind of what you know, I found that I started in the late 60s writing about films, and I found out it's a lifelong endeavor when you start writing about somebody. So I did a book there, you see it, Dancing on the Edge, Billy Wilder, Dancing on the Edge, critical study. That's a shot from Some Like It Hot, coming out from Columbia University Press this fall. And it's quite a massive book because his career is very rich. He worked in Europe a lot, and then he came to America, and then he kind of went back to Europe and made films. And you know, one reason I wanted to write that book, you know, selfishly, when I wrote the Lubitsch book, I just wanted to see all his films. They were hard to see in America. So I made 3 trips to Europe, and I curated a Lubitsch retrospective in Switzerland. And with Wilder too, I went to Germany and saw his some of his German films that were hard to see, and I studied his journalism, which is a neglected but fascinating part of his life because he considered himself a writer first and foremost, and also his early Hollywood films as a writer before he became a director are really interesting, and very few people had seen them or written about them. And so I try to connect all these different strands, which is fascinating. And that's what a critical study does. And I find there's a confusion people have between critical studies and biographies. You know, I still see people saying, oh, he's got a Wilder biography coming out. Well, it's not a biography. And, you know, people say I'm a Welles biographer. I've never tackled a Welles biography because to do that would be a lifelong job, kind of like Robert Caro has spent most of his life writing about Lyndon Johnson. And, you know, as great a biographer as he is, I wouldn't want to spend my life on one person. He did a great biography, Robert Moses, which I think is the best nonfiction book I've ever read in my life, with the possible exception of Boswell's Life of Johnson, which is the classic biography, of course. Simon Callow is in the midst of doing a Welles biography. He's on volume 4 now, and he's been at it for 20 some years, but he also has an acting career, so he's not wasting his time. But Welles is such a vast topic, you know. But biography really challenges you. And President Kennedy, who I was a volunteer in his 1960 campaign, and I wrote a book about him called Into the Nightmare, My Search for the Killers of President John F. Kennedy and Officer J.D. Tippit. That's kind of my lifelong avocation, is the Kennedy assassination. And I spent more than 30 years on that. He was asked late in his presidency what he thought of the presidency. And he says, well, that's a picture I took of him in 1960 during the campaign. He said it's what the Greeks called the pursuit of excellence, which is to do your best in a challenging situation, to bring out your, hopefully to bring out your all your talents and best qualities. It stimulates you to do that, and it forces you to do that. So biography enables you to cover a topic from all different angles: historical, social, biographical, aesthetic, many other ways of doing that. By the way, when I took that picture, the reason it's out of focus, I shoved my Brownie camera in his face, 3 feet from his face, and blew off a flashbulb in his face, which is terrible. I immediately realized I was being terribly rude, and he went like this, and then he quickly smiled. He recovered, and I felt really mortified. I think that's when I realized he was very vulnerable. I saw him in person during the campaign with little security, and I actually wrote a short story about his assassination in October 1961 because I was worried about it. But that's another story, as they say. But let's talk about biographies. Um, uh, I'll talk about the misunderstandings among the public and academia and readers to some extent. Lytton Strachey, who wrote the great book Eminent Victorians, which helped revolutionize biography, he wrote that biography is the most delicate and humane of all the branches of the art of writing. It is perhaps as difficult to write a good one as it is to live one. So why does it need defending? You know, what's the problem? They're popular biographies. People love to read them. But I think people are ambivalent about them because they, you know, it's a way of looking into somebody's life. But some people feel, well, we're being voyeuristic, and you know, and maybe that's not a good thing. And but you know, to write a judicious biography, I like that word because you have to make choices and you have to be thoughtful and not overemphasize things that are minor or whatever. And people often, I only write unauthorized biographies, and I'll start there because a lot of people think an unauthorized biography must have something wrong with it. It's sort of a synonym for salacious in a lot of people's minds. They think it's like Kitty Kelly exposing people's sex lives. It's usually connected with sex. And somehow, I don't know why, I've chosen 3 directors for whom sex was not a very big topic in their lives. I must say, I get embarrassed when I interview people and I have to ask questions about people's sex lives. You know, I'm not that kind of biographer, but one night I was sitting with Capra in his house, 7:30 at night. He was kind of relaxing, and he just started telling me about all his sexual problems in youth, which are kind of horrifying. And wow, he was really candid, and I just was writing it all down. And but that's not my main interest, but it is part of human life that you have to deal with. And but you know, the reason you write a biography of an artist is primarily because you're interested in the art. There's Frank Capra with me in 1985. I started this book in 84, and this was Capra's second to last public appearance. He was at a luncheon that Columbia Pictures gave for him at Chasen's in West Hollywood, and I had a chance to chat with him there. And I spent a year talking to him for this book from 84 to 85, and then he had a series of strokes, and starting in August 85, and I didn't get to talk to him except once after that. But I had a lot of time with him. I'll tell how that book got going, but I think to write an unauthorized biography is the only honest way you can write a biography, because once it's authorized, to quote Robert Gottlieb, the famous editor at Knopf Random House, who was my editor on the Capra book for a while until he betrayed me, he said, if you write an authorized biography, there's always a price to be paid. And boy, was he right. And I was doing an unauthorized book, but I found out they sort of secretly authorized it behind my back and without telling me, which is really created 4 years of problems. There's a new biography of Philip Roth by Blake Bailey, which is causing controversy, and I contributed to the World Socialist website, good publication. They have a forum protesting the suppression of that book. It came out in early April, and by the end of the month was being recalled and pulped by its publisher, Norton, because of some allegations made against the author anonymously, have never been brought to court. This is another issue I want to talk about, is this whole cancel culture, as Barack Obama called it. And the right wing has now taken up the title, the phrase cancel culture. But we're in this terrible neo-McCarthy period where if people did something in the past that isn't politically correct now, or if they committed some crime in the past, and a lot of artists have committed crimes, unfortunately. There's no artist who's a saint. And to quote the ending line of Kiss Me Stupid, nobody's perfect. And if we start saying we don't want to read a book or see a movie by somebody or look at a painting or hear music by somebody unless they're perfect, very soon we'll have no art left. And I think that's the goal of the cancel culture mob, which is like the McCarthy people. McCarthy's henchmen, Cohn and Shine, were out there trying to ban books, and Ray Bradbury wrote Fahrenheit 451 about that. And he said the world is full of people running around with lit matches trying to burn books. And but anyway, Blake Bailey is accused of certain things, and I don't know the history of that, but it's never been brought to court. And one of the things I learned in the Kennedy assassination was that the first day Oswald was being tried and convicted by the media on television, and then he was executed on TV, lynched in the police station, surrounded by the media and 60 policemen. And that's not, I thought I was 16. This is not the way I was taught in civics class that our country is supposed to function. First, you have a trial, then you might go to jail, or you might get acquitted or whatever, but you have a trial, you know, before a jury. But in America, we're guilty until presumed, we're supposed to be presumed innocent until proven guilty, but it's the other way around. If you're accused of something, you're automatically convicted in the media. And I will say, though, that Blake Bailey was the authorized biography of Roth, who was an extremely controlling subject to an insane degree almost. He would send him voluminous memoranda and questions to ask people. And I mean, really controlling. And this guy went along with that. And I think Roth was ill-served by that biography because Bailey just took his point of view on everything uncritically and just defended him against everything and just trashed the people that Roth didn't like, et cetera, especially women. And so I think that's one of the dangers of authorized biographies, is you get too close to the subject. Leon Edel, who's the great biographer of Henry James, wrote a book that I read every time I do a biography called Writing Lives, Principia Bibliographica, Biographica. And he says in there, biographers should ideally be a participant-observer. And by that, he means you can be involved with the subject and still maintain your distance as an observer. And with Welles, I think I've managed to navigate that as not a biographer, but a commentator in 3 books. I got close with him as an actor. Can't get much closer than that. Although somebody said in my Spielberg book, this will get you closer to Steven Spielberg than anybody except Kate Capshaw could get. You know, that was a nice compliment. But anyway, with Welles, I still managed to keep my distance, and he would say, Joe doesn't like my Shakespearean films. And I had to explain, no, I love Chimes of Midnight, but I think you were miscast in Othello, and I changed my mind on Macbeth. And, you know, in other words, like, he kind of accepted that I didn't just uncritically like everything he did. But it was very valuable for me to get to know him because there's so many myths surrounding him. And I think part of my role and why he put me in a film was he wanted a historian on the set of The Other Side of the Wind to correct myths about the shooting, which I'm still doing. And the media love to make up stories about him and lie about him, as the movie Mank shows. And he would call me in sometimes and explain what he was doing. I'm doing this, and this is why I'm doing this, and this is where I got the idea, and, you know, blah, blah, blah. And there's a picture of me with him in 1978 that Gary Graver took when Welles was doing a talk show, which never got picked up, and you can see it on YouTube. But so a lot of people criticize biographies, including some serious people like Joyce Carol Oates, the insanely prolific author. My friend John Sanford, who is a writer who died at age 99, said that Joyce Carol Oates must have a group of writers chained in her basement writing her books, because she's done, I don't know, 120 books or something. I don't know how she does it, but she coined this terrible word, pathography, or pathobiography or pathography, I forget, which means that unauthorized biographies or books that expose people are horrible because there's something pathological about that desire to find out about people's private lives. And I think she's being defensive as a public figure. She doesn't want people to pry into whatever her private life is, uh, but Bob Thomas, who is a Hollywood biographer and a mentor of mine, said that early on, he told me the reason people read biographies, he thinks, is they think they know somebody, but they want to find out things they didn't know about that person. I think that's a pretty good definition of why biographies are interesting to people. You want to know the hidden truth. And my whole life has been devoted to exposing hidden truths and myths, because I was raised as a Catholic, sort of brainwashed as a cult member, basically, brainwashed in the Cold War mentality by the Democratic Party, and Joe McCarthy was my senator. We didn't like Joe McCarthy in our family, but I grew up in that whole world of anti-communism, communists, we have to hide under our desks and all this kind of crazy stuff. So I was brainwashed, and it took me a long time to break out of that until I was 19. And so I felt I was lied to by the media, by the church, by my parents, by the schools. And so my whole life has been an attempt to expose the truth and the Kennedy assassination, but also in the life of Frank Capra and the life of John Ford, Steven Spielberg. And I'll just, in a nutshell, say why. But first I'll quote Dr. Samuel Johnson, who defended the art of biography. He said, if a man is to write a panegyric, he may keep vices out of sight, but if he professes to write a life, he must represent it as it really was. And that's my kind of motto. So the three subjects I've had, I made it clear to them, I'm not doing an authorized biography. I want independence. Well, like when I wrote Spielberg, I took the precaution of interviewing 100 people before I approached him for an interview. And I wrote a letter and said, I'd like to interview you. But, I made it clear the book was moving ahead, whether he liked it or not, because he's a control freak and I'm a control freak. And it's like a collision of two big control freaks. Here he is at 16 making his first feature, Firelight. And there's his dad, Arnold, in the background, who worked with him, who I interviewed. That was a real coup to get an interview with his father. Nobody had really interviewed his father. But in the case of Ford, I thought, here's this really great, sensitive, poetic filmmaker who comes off like this gruff ruffian, illiterate. I found a quote where he said to Hedda Hopper, I pose as an illiterate, don't let this get around. So this was a pose. So I thought, well, how do you connect this sensitive work with this rough and tough guy who won't explain his work? And I had 1 hour with Ford, which was invaluable, to observe him at close range and study his body language and his sensitivities. And he wouldn't answer a lot of my questions. You can hear the interview online. I put it up there. It's embarrassing, but it's my first interview in Hollywood was with the most difficult person to interview. But he did say some good things, some thoughtful things. And I arrived on the last day of his career by chance. He retired in the course of my interview. I took that photograph that shows you his mood. He kept talking to his secretary and saying, has the Italian gentleman called yet, or the gentleman from Italy? And I didn't know what that meant until years later. I went into his papers for that week in August 1970, my first week in Hollywood. And I found out he was waiting for a call from Italy. His friend and actor Woody Strode was trying to set up an Italian Western for Ford to direct, and he wasn't getting the call from the producer. And he realized at that point it's not going to happen. So his career, which began 56 years earlier, was ending when I walked in. And here's this 23-year-old kid asking these questions about Ford Apache and the searchers. It's the last thing he wanted to hear about. But so my challenge in that was to connect the work and the life, and also this terribly complicated man. How do you deal with his complications? And then with Spielberg, I felt outraged that here is this guy who I think is a great filmmaker, and he's treated It's better now than when I started in the 90s. He's taken a little more seriously, but he's still scorned by most people in academia, like at San Francisco State, when I've only been allowed to teach him once. And when I proposed that, I was told, you'd be pandering to the students. Can you imagine this? And now he's an old timer, and he's one of the last classical filmmakers. But he's like Hitchcock was. And I remember back in the 50s, people didn't take Hitchcock seriously. They thought he was some crass entertainer, like a lot of people thought Spielberg was. So I thought, well, nobody's written even a decent critical study of this guy, let alone a good biography. There was a little tiny biography that had some good points to it, but nobody had really done the job. So I thought, I'm going to go out and do it. It's also a great story about a kid filmmaker who was ostracized and tyrannized by other kids. And he invented himself at the age of 10 in 1957, which means he's been, what, 64 years as a filmmaker. And he made himself into a filmmaker. And all these kids, I interviewed all the kids who worked with him and the adults who knew him. And they all said, we've been waiting for somebody to ring our bell for 30 years. This is a great story. And now he's doing his own film about his youth, which should be interesting this summer. Although I just read that the character is not called Stephen and it's a fictionalized version of him. I don't know why he would do that. But anyway, we'll see how it turns out. But Nigel Morris, who wrote the best critical study of Spielberg after I did my book, he calls me the godfather of Spielberg studies. And that's because nobody else had dared to say he's a great director in a really long, serious book. And with Capra, though, it's a different story. I was always a big Capra fan. David Thompson, who wrote this, the biographical history or dictionary of the cinema, called me a leading Capra adulator, and he described my book as a horrified biography. There I am again with Capra. He made me sit down because I was so much taller than him. That's why we sat down. He didn't want to be photographed with me towering over him. I found him a rather charming fellow. He had a great smile, and he was very funny and very Hamish, to use a Yiddish expression. But he was also a very complicated man. And I was worried, I was bothered by the fact that this guy who I admired so much, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, one of my favorite films, Mr. Deeds Goes to Town, etc. His career collapsed after World War II, totally collapsed. He made one pretty good film, It's a Wonderful Life, which I think is overrated, but it's still pretty good. And then everything after that is no good at all. And then he had trouble making films, and I wondered what was the story there, being an old reporter since 1960, when I sold my first article. I always want to know the questions the media don't answer for you. And so in his book, The Name Above the Title, I found a clue, and that helped answer the question. But first, I'll tell you, when I first met Capra in 1975, I was on Variety at the time, and that was kind of my film school, that and the Welles experience. On Variety, I got to go on sets of films and interview any filmmaker I wanted. And you can't do that today because they protect all these people from the media. But I was able to go on sets of films and watch people shoot. And, I saw Hitchcock shooting and Billy Wilder and all kinds of people. And so I called up Capra and I said, could I come down to see you in the desert where he was living? And he said, sure, come on down. So in 1975, I was having lunch with him at some posh country club. And he was saying how he hated bankers and rich people. He was doing his whole Frank Capra populist rap, And this guy came to the table wearing a sport coat and all that. And he had these pictures. He said, Frank, I've got the pictures of you playing golf with President Ford. And Capra said, oh, God, look at these wonderful pictures. Jerry Ford, Jesus. He said he's such a funny guy because he hits the ball and it goes all over the place, and, hits people in the head. And but he was so thrilled to see these pictures. And in one of them, I'll never forget this picture. Capra is putting, and Gerald Ford, the president's holding the pin for him, like a caddy, like I used to be a golf caddy. And I thought that's the ultimate immigrant fantasy, the president holding the pin for you while you putt. And so Capra was so thrilled by these, and the guy said, I'll make copies of these for you for next week. So then Capra turned back to me and he said, where was I? He said, oh, I was telling you how I hate bankers and rich people. And he starts going on. And I thought, wait a second, this guy is not who he appears to be. He's not who he claims to be. There's something wrong here. And I made a mental note, find out more, in effect. And it took me a number of years to get down to doing it because I was still a screenwriter and I was reluctant to let go of that. But I kept thinking, I've got a story here that I should tell. And then I did the AFI Life Achievement Award tribute to Capra, and I got to know him much better. And I got to know other people who worked with him who filled me in on different sides of his personality. And I spent 2 months with him writing his Life Achievement Award acceptance speech. And at one point he was saying he would bring in draft material and I would bring in material. And I didn't know he had a ghostwriter, but he brought in a thing saying the two things are important to me: the love of people and the equal importance of each human being. That's the formula upon which I based all my films. And I said, gee, why don't we change formula to principle? Wouldn't that sound better? He said, oh, okay, principle. And now I wish I'd kept it as formula, because for him it was a formula, it wasn't a principle. But anyway, I got to know him, and then I thought, well, there's a story here. And I went to Wesleyan University in 1981. I heard that they had his papers, and nobody had seen them. And Janine Basinger was a AFI connected person, and she was a film professor there. And I called her up, and she was very nice. And yeah, come on out and look at the papers. We haven't even opened the boxes yet. You were the first person to see them. And so I flew out there, and she and I opened the boxes in the basement. And I thought in his autobiography, there's a section that was incongruous. In 1951, he went to a film festival in India representing the State Department, and he was very stridently anti-communist in a way that seemed strange. And I wondered where that came from. And that was around the time his career was collapsing. And so I asked for the box for 1951, and we opened it. And 10 minutes later, I had the story, basically, which was that he was an informer during the blacklist period. And he'd written this 225-page, roughly, document. He called it to me a mea culpa document about his entire life, proving that he was a good American, good Catholic, and hated communists and ran the communists out of the Directors Guild and one thing or another. And he informed on several of his colleagues, including some screenwriters such as Sidney Buckman, who wrote Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and Ian McClellan Hunter, who worked on Roman Holiday with him that he didn't wind up directing, even though Hunter was fronting for Dalton Trumbo. He said to me, could you imagine if Capra knew that Dalton wrote that script? And the other, another one was Michael Wilson, who did the final polish on It's a Wonderful Life, for example. And so I was really stunned. You know, this is a big revelation. Frank Capra was an informer during the blacklist period. I mean, we all knew that Kazan was, but for Capra he violated the principles of his best films, like Mr. Smith, which is a defense of freedom of expression, freedom of speech. And I thought this is a big story the media have missed all these years. And so I started looking into it, and then I thought, well, I should do this book. And I started in 1984, and Janine Basinger at Wesleyan, the archivist, she said, you'll have complete freedom to read all the documents and quote as much as you want from the unpublished material. We have the copyright, et cetera. And I had offers from Simon & Schuster and Knopf, and I went with Knopf because of the great Robert Gottlieb, who was Robert Caro's editor. And I thought most film biographies were kind of weak because they sort of rush through people's early lives. And as we know from psychologists, our early life is when we're formed. And they would interview like 8 people, and they usually be movie stars who usually are the last people who know much about the person. And so I thought I will interview ordinary people, so-called, like Caro did for his Johnson book. He interviewed women in the hill country who had slaved away without electricity, for example, the opening of the book. It's a great section. And so I interviewed 185 people, including people who went to school with Capra and his neighbors. And the crew guys were the people I started with, his cameraman and the other crew. And they were terrific because they really knew how Capra worked. There's Joseph Walker, who shot 20 of his films. And here am I. This is a Directors Guild event that we did together before I did my book. And they gave me a very different portrait of Capra from what he was saying. And so I would go to him and interview him, and he would lie to me all the time. His book is a lie from start to finish, as the New York Times put it in their review. And that was good discipline for me because I couldn't take anything at face value. I had to check even his, the two things he tells the truth about are the day he was born, he gets correct, and the day he left for America. But I checked both. Everything else is pretty much a lie. He rewrote his life as a Capra film, and people bought it, and I even bought it. I thought it was a charming story, but it's a fabrication to restore his reputation. So anyway, I was jousting with him. Basically, I would say, well, you did this and you did that, and he'd lie about it. But it became like a game. What I had to do was get the truth from other people and then go back to him. For example, he said he had a wonderful time in high school, and high school years were extremely important to him because it's the first time this Italian immigrant kid went into sort of a waspish neighborhood to kind of try to assimilate into American society. And I was hearing from his classmates, we had a wonderful time, we all got along great, but they didn't remember him. And the only good thing Janine Basinger ever said was, well, that's the story. Maybe they didn't remember him. So finally, I kept interviewing person after person. I finally got to a woman who was the historian of their class. And she said something I found really shocking. She said, well, I dated him a little, but my mother stopped it because he was an Italian immigrant. And she said he was a nice boy. He was just a terrible wop. He was a slur for Italians. And I thought, wow, that's terrible. And I began to feel angry for Capra. I felt angry at Capra for a while because he had betrayed his principles. And I'm motivated to write biographies, partly something John Ford said really rang a bell with me. Somebody asked him in the 1930s, do you believe as a director in including things that bother you? And Ford said, what the hell else does a man live for? And so that goes back to my correcting the myths thing. I was angry at Capra for violating our trust, who he was. But now I started to be angry for him because I felt, geez, he was treated terribly as an immigrant. So I went back to him and I said, this is what this lady said. And he said, yeah, it's true. They treated me really badly. They treated me like a peon. I was washing the blackboards at 5:30 in the morning, and I was wearing cardboard shoes, and the girls wouldn't go out with me because I had funny clothes. And the whole story came pouring out, So that was what I had to do. And to make a long story short, I tell this whole story, and frankly, I started finding out so many things. And Bob Gottlieb said a strange thing after a while. He said, you know it all, you may know too much. And I thought, that's a very strange thing for an editor to tell his author. How could you know too much? Isn't that why they hired me to do this book? And so then he hired Janine Basinger to do a book on It's a Wonderful Life. And I was very upset because I thought that violated all kinds of agreements we had. And then she started being difficult, withholding documents and withholding permission. And Gottlieb started taking her aside. It turned out they were working against me, in short, to sabotage my book, which is shocking. One of my friends who later won the Pulitzer Prize said this was the most bizarre story I ever heard, the worst thing I ever heard. Offending Frank Capra is the least of it. It's a real mystery. I've never heard a story like this. So they were trying to thwart my book, and I finally figured out that they were hoping to turn the book over to her, and she was going to cut and censor and sanitize the book and cut out all the political stuff, basically, and release a sanitized version. But I wasn't about to let that happen. I invested everything I had in this book, and so I finally prevailed. It took 4 years of legal battle to win this battle, but I took it away from them, and I went to Simon & Schuster, and I see Virginia Clark here, who is my wonderful copy editor, who really improved the book, and she was a joy to work with. They were very professional. Bob Bender, the editor, did a wonderful job. The legal department, in contrast to Random House's crooked legal department, supported me, and it turned out very well. And but now the other books, Ford cooperated to the extent of giving me an interview, which I'm grateful for, and he didn't thwart me, and he kind of encouraged me. Spielberg was the most encouraging, oddly enough. Even though he wouldn't give me an interview, he told his staff tell people when they called up, should we talk to McBride? And they were told I was kosher, which I thought was really nice of them. So that opened doors a lot. And but he told his mother not to talk to me, which is kind of funny. I guess your mother knows the really bad stuff, you know, like what you have under your bed and all that, literally. And I got to his father, and then he found out I talked to his father, and he told the father not to talk to me anymore. But I had a wonderful interview with his father. His mother was interviewed so much on TV and print. She was a real character. I was able to quote anything I wanted from her pretty much. I would have liked to have talked to her. I did chat with her briefly. She was very nice and sweet. But that was about all they did to thwart me at all. But otherwise, you know, I was told that he knows my work and he wouldn't try to give me a hard time. But you know, I never got to interview him. I would have liked to, but I didn't need to because he's given so many interviews over the years. I could find a quote from him on almost anything. So, you know, when you write a biography, it's kind of a challenge to deal with the problem of, first of all, dealing with the living subject. I think sometimes it'd be easier to deal with a dead subject, you know, but there is something about, like with Spielberg, he's my age, and I thought, well, you know, all these people are still alive. I would have loved to have talked to Capra's parents, for example, but I couldn't. But I could talk to Spielberg's father, and I could talk to his babysitter and the lady across the street, and I could talk to his teachers and kids who worked with him. And you know, what a wonderful opportunity. All the people that I talked to about Capra are dead now. You know, could never be done again. And so I think that's one reason to do a book about people who are alive. But to tell the truth about people, you run into some problems. And Lytton Strachey said a biographer has to attack his subject in unexpected places and to shoot a searchlight into obscure recesses hitherto undivined. And so that's what I was trying to do. I was trying to find out what, for example, informing did to Frank Capra. It ruined him. The first half of his life was a great success, and the second half was a catastrophe. And I got the title from Tennessee Williams, who said, he wrote a piece after he did the Last Menagerie. He wrote a piece called On the Catastrophe of Success, all the changes that came in his life and caused him problems. Capra did not handle success well. It made him feel like an imposter. There's a thing called the imposter syndrome, where he felt he wasn't worthy of it. And he had an actual physical and mental collapse and almost died after he became successful. And he kind of ruined his own career. He sabotaged himself, and he blacklisted himself, in effect. And his later years were really sad. I read all the scripts that he was trying to peddle and couldn't sell, and it was just a really sad tragedy. It's a great American tragedy. Spielberg, on the other hand, has handled success very well. I think he's more mature. And I think, and Ford, of course, handled success very well over a long period in a difficult Hollywood system, partly by doing, you know, like 2 films for them and 1 film for me. And, you know, he was a journeyman director, he called himself. He played down his artistic ambitions, because in Hollywood, if you say I'm a great artist, you know, they'll kill you, like they did with Welles and Renoir and Sternberg. But Ford would just say, I'm just doing a job of work, and he would disguise his artistic ambitions. But he had pet projects that they knew that he wanted to do. And so his track record is really great, but he made some really bad films along the way, but that was the price he paid. His brother Francis, who wasn't as successful over the long haul as him, but was his early teacher and mentor, he said Jack was durable. That was the word he used. That's a good word for him. But what I found out later, there's, as Henry James calls it, the figure in the carpet that explains an artist's work. You know, he wrote a story of that kind, and there's some pattern, and you don't actually know why you're doing these things. I realized years later, why did I write biographies of these 3 people? I think it's the ethnic theme is what interested me on a deep level. Capra rejected his ethnicity. He tried to run away from being an Italian, and that really ruined him. He alienated his family. He hated everybody. I mean, he was a misanthrope. That was one of the big revelations. This guy, everybody thought was like Gandhi, hated everybody. even his own fellow Italians. And, it's kind of shocking. He was racist about black people. He was anti-Semitic, and just really, wow. Um, but Ford embraced his Irishness at a time when that was not popular. You were supposed to assimilate and be part of the melting pot in America, and Ford was way ahead of the time. It didn't become trendy until Alex Haley wrote Roots to embrace your heritage, and now we all do, and we have ancestry.com, and we're proud of our ancestors. And Ford was way ahead of the curve, and so he had a vision of a multicultural America, which America's best strengths are. And he grew up in a multicultural neighborhood with black neighbors and French Canadians and Germans and Jews. And he was a Shabbos goy for a while. And in his films, you always see black people, for example. Sometimes they're stereotypical, sometimes not. But in Howard Hawks' films, you almost never see them, for example, because he was just a quintessential WASP who lived in a kind of fantasy world of WASP privilege. Spielberg started out being kind of like Capra. He was ashamed. He said he was ashamed of being Jewish. He was embarrassed by it because he grew up in a Jewish neighborhood in Cincinnati. Then he moved to a more waspy area in Phoenix, where they were among the few Jews there. And then he moved to Saratoga, California, in Northern California, which was really hostile to him. That's where he had his worst experiences. And so he tried to kind of disguise his Jewishness and deny it. And then he became kind of more like Ford in later years as he went on and made Schindler's List and became a father, and he embraced his Jewish heritage. And I think that was a very positive thing that made him a healthy human being. And so, these three guys took different paths about their ethnicity. And I relate that to how I felt sort of ashamed of being from the Midwest when I was a kid, even though I knew that I was not some kind of a hayseed or something, but I was from a newspaper family, sophisticated parents, but people would put me down all the time, and I always felt kind of alienated because of that, and I would try to disguise it sometimes. And I went through some of those same things, and I had some complex about it, and I think I've worked through that. But that's a theme that strikes a deep chord in me, and I think all biographers may have that. Edel says that the subject chooses the biographer. That's an interesting comment. Somehow Capra's life chose me as a biographer. Now, in recent years, we're running short on time. I want to get some questions, but I've gone back to writing critical studies, and I did the Lubitsch book and I did the Wilder book, and there are biographical elements, and I studied Wilder's life to some extent, but I don't interview 200 people anymore, but I interviewed some key people to find out some things that I needed to know. And I went into documents and all that, but I found that you can't afford, here I am with Billy Wilder in 1974 on the set of the front page, interviewing him with a Japanese journalist. And so I interviewed him over the years. I was fortunate to get to know him, and I really admired his work and his life. And he was generous with his time, and I interviewed him over a period of a couple of days in the 80s. And I interviewed I.L. Diamond, his collaborator, and Jack Lemmon and Welder Marathon, people like that, and friends of his. So you'll find some of that fresh material in my book. But I found that doing biographies is terribly expensive, for one thing. They never give you enough advance for the amount of work that I put into it, because I really try to do it properly. And to do that, I pour vast sums of my own money into biographies, or I used to, and I would always go bankrupt by the end of it, and I couldn't afford to do that anymore. I got a teaching job at San Francisco State in 2001, which is great, because it's one way our culture subsidizes writers is you teach, and I enjoy teaching a lot. I love talking to young people and showing them films and getting them, sharing my enthusiasms. But you can write on the side, and I write at night. But I can't afford to write biographies, frankly, and they don't sell very much. They don't justify their expense. And I realize that the public is not terribly interested in the lives of film directors. They may be interested in actors, but I've never had an actor I felt strongly enough to write about. I thought of doing a biography of Spencer Tracy, who went to my high school, but somebody else did one. But Critical studies still cost money. I put out my own money, but it's manageable. And but I've gone back to what I used to do. But critical studies are really challenging because they're about the work. And like Lubitsch's life was actually not all that exciting to write about. I mean, not like Capra, Ford, or Spielberg have had complex lives. Lubitsch was just a workaholic, and the most interesting thing about him was that he made these great romantic films, but he kept having unhappy romances, which is interesting. But um, you know, I didn't think a biography of him was necessary. There is one that's, you know, but his films were not totally understood or appreciated, so I wanted to bring them back into prominence. And with Wilder, there's a very good biography by Ed Sickoff, and there's a good one, a couple of good German biographies. So his his life has been covered pretty well, with a few gaps that I tried to fill in. But his films are still somewhat misunderstood, and in certain circles, he's very popular among some people, but some people think he's just a heartless cynic, which is not true at all. I think he was a disappointed romantic. Uh, and his latent romanticism came out in his later work. That's kind of what I deal with a lot in my films. So I'm a champion of Wilder's later work, even though it's uneven. He made some very moving, very beautiful films in his later years. I think Avanti is probably his best film. So I try to shake up and challenge the conventional wisdom with these people, and so the books have some, hopefully, a corrective function, trying to, like with Capra's scholarship, I felt it was all based on false premises before I came along, because they all believed his book. And then I noticed books came out after mine where they hurriedly corrected all, the records about, this and that. But a lot of the people said, well, we always understood that he was really a Republican, a conservative. And well, you wouldn't find that in those books. You found a lot of confusion about his politics, because as Chester Stitch told me, who was Capra's secretary, the secretary is a great source. Um, Chet Stitch was with him for 39 years, a really smart guy, and he was willing to tell me almost anything. And he said what Capra's secret back in his heyday was he would work with people from a wide range of political views. He had liberals, communists, middle of the road people, conservatives, and he synthesized their point of view, and he kind of took it upon himself to create a film. But the films are contradictory, and they confuse people, because sometimes there'll be a liberal scene and then a conservative scene, and this and that, and people didn't understand it. But now that I understand where all that comes from, I actually like Capra's films more. I see problems with them, but I appreciate his work more, and I can see where he's coming from. But the problem was, after the war, when the Red Scare came in, he actually said, I'll never work with another liberal again. And if you won't work with a liberal writer, you can't work with like 98% of writers in Hollywood. So he started working with a guy named Miles Connolly, who was kind of a whack job, far right extremist, and they wrote really horrible stuff. So he kind of shot himself in the foot. But I think if you understand where these people come from, it can help you appreciate the work, and the work is really important. We didn't have a chance actually to talk about cancel culture much, but I think you still have to separate the creator from the work, because as I say, if you ban all the artists who have flaws, you wouldn't have Picasso, and you wouldn't have Mozart, and you can just Hemingway, you just go through the list, and we'd be very impoverished. And human beings are complicated creatures, and we should study them. And even though Blake Bailey's book on Roth, Blake Bailey, I don't know if he's a flawed human, he may well be, but his book is not very good. But I defended his right to publish it. As one of my friends wrote, even if the charges against him are true, we should still be able to read the book and judge it for ourselves, just like Roman Polanski's film J'accuse. He was a criminal. He fled the country, but he made a great film about the Dreyfus Affair. We're not allowed to see that. And so these issues are very important. And we tend to romanticize artists in our culture. We tend to think, well, if I love Frank Capra's films, he must be a wonderful guy. Well, it's not that simple, folks. And John Ford was a very complicated individual, but he made great films. But that's where it comes from. I'll just end by reading one quote from William Butler Yeats, who said, "We make out of the quarrel with others rhetoric, but of the quarrel with ourselves poetry." And I thought of using that in my first Capra book, but I didn't. But it's in the second, and that's the quarrel with others is our public persona, but the quarrel with ourselves is where the art comes from, and that's what I try to get into. So let's take some questions here. I guess Tess is the question person. I'd love to hear from you guys. And if you disagree with me, hey, great. Yeah.
Yes, we have a lot of questions. So let's start with, what do you think of a situation, this is from Matthew, what do you think of a situation where the subject gives complete cooperation but does not have final approval of the book?
Oh, where the subject doesn't have approval. Well, I don't believe those things. You read those all the time in authorized biographies. They always say at the end, I thank the subject and his family and, blah, blah, blah. And I'm really grateful they didn't ask to see the book or demand approval. That's just total bullshit, in my opinion. I can't imagine. Maybe there's somebody, maybe Gandhi would have done that, but there aren't too many people like that. But I just don't buy that. There's always some compromises. Bob Gottlieb said, there's always some price to be paid. And I would never make a deal with the subject. I just think, it's just, you don't know what's going to happen, for one thing. If you start making deals with these people, it's not a good thing. You sign away your artistic integrity and you're supposed to be a truth teller, because you as readers want to know the truth about these people, and you don't want some compromised intermediary getting in the way.
Okay, the next question. How many sources, this is from Jennifer, how many sources do you feel you have to weigh to decide the truth of stories your subject tells?
Well, when I asked Bob Thomas about that, he gave me some good advice, and some I followed and some I didn't follow. But I said to him early on, I said, what do you do when you have two people who tell you totally opposite stories about the same thing? This happens a lot in life. And I think, honestly, like in my family, I have 6 siblings, and we all talk about a vacation we had in 1958, which was a disaster. And we all love telling stories, but we all contradict each other. So, we're all being honest, but we see it differently. That's part of human nature. But Bob said, just pick the story you prefer that makes the better story. And I thought, no, I'm not going to do that, because that's not honest, So my solution to that, and I'm reading a biography now, I won't mention it because I'm not finished with it, but the guy is sort of doing that a lot. He's saying, well, we don't really know about this and we don't know about that. Well, the solution to that is do more research. Like with Capra, I wasn't buying the idea that everything was hunky-dory at their high school. So I just kept digging and digging until, I found person number 16, and she unloaded the true story. And then, very few people are willing to say, I treated this kid badly because he's an Italian. I beat up on him because he was Jewish or whatever. And, but you get the story eventually. It's kind of a mosaic. You get it from a lot of different sources. And documents are extremely important, because people's memories are flawed and people are self-serving. But I go back to documents. For example, one of the key discoveries I made about Spielberg, I had picked up on the fact that his father was much more important to his life than Steven admitted. That he had a schism with his father, and he felt that his father had hindered his artistic ambitions. And these kids kept telling me, well, no, Mr. Spielberg was making the films with Steven. We didn't even know who was directing them sometimes. And he's a great guy. And so I went into the courthouse in San Jose and got the divorce records. Nobody had ever bothered to do that. I found out that Arnold Spielberg got custody of his son, not the mother. And Steven went to LA with his father after graduation. They lived together for a while. Then they had some problems. And then I found out the whole story, and I had to be careful about it in the book, but I had the story that his mother fell in love with another guy, Bernie Adler. And the father was admittedly sort of a workaholic, and he was away a lot. And so Steven was angry at his mother for breaking up the family as he saw it. And I heard this from his friends, so I had to be, diplomatic about telling the story. But many years later, I mean, one thing I was trying to do with my Spielberg work was to try to bring about a rapprochement between Steven and his father, because I thought, his father was got a bad break in this situation, and it worked. And they I don't take total credit for it, but probably some credit that they were on the cover of Life magazine. Their reunion was such a big deal. It's on the cover of Life. And then Steven and his parents did an interview on TV a few years ago where they told the whole story, just as I had it back then, that his mother said, I fell in love with this other guy. And Arnold said, I knew it, but I took the blame because I thought that's what the man should do. And Stephen was angry at me. And, the whole story came out. So just keep digging and digging and digging. That's why it costs so much and takes so much time to do these books.
Okay, we've had quite a few people ask to talk a little more about Orson Welles.
Sure.
Is there anything else you would like to share about that?
Well, that's a big subject. I did an interview today about Citizen Kane, which was the film that got me going as a film writer. In 1966, I saw that film. It changed my life because I was going to be a journalist, which I already was, and a novelist. And then I saw Kane, and I thought, no, I'm going to write films and direct films and write about films. And I started doing that. So I spent most of my college years writing this book on Welles. And then through a series of strange events, which I've written about, you can read, I got into this film, The Other Side of the Wind, which was his most important late film. He's had another film that came out since then, and there are more still coming out. But this film I worked on for 48 years, off and on. This is 1971. We're at producer's studio in Hollywood, a rental studio. That's me up there on the porch watching Welles shooting. And Gary Graver, his indispensable cameraman, is the guy in the brown shirt playing a part. And Frank Marshall is the guy in the red shirt. He's a big producer now. And Frank got the film finished. After 5 years of shooting, Welles ran into all kinds of financial, legal, and political problems, and he couldn't get it finished. And so I tried over the years with Gary to get it finished, and we had a deal with Showtime that fell through. And then finally Netflix came up with $6 million to finish it. And I was the consultant on the completion of the film with Jonathan Rosenbaum. And I think it came out great. It came out brilliantly. And but I spent half my life trying to help get that film out. Everybody felt about Welles. I mean, the myth was he was self-destructive and sat around eating all the time and drinking. And that's just a lie. And in later years, he was working all the time. Every day he was shooting film. That's what he loved to do. And Ford said the same thing. I just love going to the studio at 9 o'clock in the morning and telling the guys to roll them, and that's all I live for. This is the first day of shooting, Welles directing me and Peter Bogdanovich. I had never acted before, so it was a Walter Mitty kind of bizarre experience. But Welles let me write my questions with him because I play a gauche young film critic who's barraging John Huston's character with silly film buff questions. And so Welles thought that was hilarious. So I was playing a kind of exaggerated version of my own youthful gaucherie. But I got a little lost there. What was I saying about? We were talking about just the experience of being in this film. And I was going to say that Welles is mercurial. I mean, he formed the Mercury Theater with John Houseman, but he would have a bad temper sometimes. He gave me a hard time for 3 years because I was a non-actor. He kind of bullied me, but he treated all the other actors like babies with kid gloves. He was a great actors director, probably the best there ever was. And I was willing to go along with whatever he told me. He let me write the dialogue with him, but then he insisted on total control of my inflections and my movements, and I couldn't improvise because I didn't know how to do it. And so after 3 years, though, one of the crew slipped a compliment that Welles had said about the rushes that he enjoyed my acting. And then I relaxed for the next 3 years. This is funny. Toward the end of the film, this is me, and right before the ending, it ends with John Huston doing a talk about movies that's very moving. it cuts to a drive-in theater. And this is me sitting there asleep at the end of this party. That's the framework of the film. But this was not me. What happened was Peter Bogdanovich started playing a critic, and then he became a famous director, and then Welles put him in the role as a director. And then he recast that part. But Peter had shot this scene earlier, and I pointed out as part of my job as a consultant that, well, wait a second, you can't have Peter in two places at once, right? And I said, maybe you could get ILM to put somebody else's head on Peter's body, you know? And I didn't realize they were going to put my head on Peter's body. And that's my head. They did an amazing job of, I don't know how they did this. I don't know where they got that shot. And they even put 5 o'clock shadow on my face, because this is like 6:30 in the morning and I'm passed out. But somehow I got into Peter's clothing during the course of the evening. I don't know how that happened. That introduces a whole kinky level of subtext that was not explored in the film. But I had changed from my really crummy looking Sears Roebuck suit into Peter's sort of semi-spiffy young director outfit. Although when Welles said to Peter, bring me your clothing and show me, you know, we'll pick your clothing for the film. And Peter had a suitcase of all his cool clothes, you know. And Welles said, well, that's not the kind of thing that a hot young director would wear. And Peter said, well, that's what I wear. And he said, well, okay, you know, but anyway.
So in reference to Welles, we have a question from Lauren. There's someone looking for the lost Ambersons footage. What do you think the odds are?
Well, I tried for years. I kept saying, I'm going to do this. That was a dream of mine because it's my favorite film of all time. I think it's the greatest film ever made, and it was deeply mutilated by RKO. And I've studied this my whole life. And I think the best piece of film criticism I ever wrote is my first verbal reconstruction of that film, which I spent a month in 1968 writing, and then I revised it. But there's a rumor that it may have been left behind in Brazil when Welles was down there making a film for the US government and he had to leave. And there were 31 cans of Ambersons, the 132-minute version that RKO subsequently hacked up and reshot a lot of. And there are also cans of Journey into Fear. I wanted to go down there and find it, and Bill Crone, a friend of mine who co-directed a documentary on It's All True, did some sleuthing, and he felt that Welles had given the footage to a guy who ran a laboratory down there who was a super film buff. And Bill did a little digging and asked the daughter, who now owns it, do you guys have that film? And she said, I don't think so. But anyway, I never got around to going down there. But this fellow, Josh Grossberg, has been on the trail since 2000. He's going down there, so I'm totally thrilled and supportive of him. And some of my former students live in Brazil, and they offered to help him. And boy, I hope he finds that stuff. I mean, what a thrill that would be to find the uncut Ambersons, you know. But then some problem will occur if they do, like somebody will sue and try to, you know, I mean, something happens on every Welles. I'm being a little facetious here, but I sure hope they find it.
So here's a question and comment from Joe Green. He says, hi, Joe, good to see you looking well. I saw just before I got on that Norman Lloyd died, who worked with Welles in the Mercury Theater before doing Saboteur with Hitchcock. Any comment on him?
Yeah, I just wrote a little brief tribute because I was preparing this show, but I knew Norman. He was a marvel of the human race, 106 years old. He died in his sleep. We should all be so lucky, I guess. And he worked with Renoir, Hitchcock, Chaplin, Welles, Stanley Kubrick, you know, everybody. He was Sin of the Poet in Welles's Caesar production, and he was the guy dangling off of the, falling off the Statue of Liberty in Saboteur. And he and Joan Harrison did the Alfred Hitchcock Presents series, and he did the Lincoln series for Omnibus in the 50s with James Agee wrote, and Stanley Kubrick was the second unit cameraman on that film. And Norman was a wonderful man. I knew him at Renoir's house. I'd go to see Jean Renoir with Todd McCarthy every Saturday for the last 3 years of Renoir's life. We would take a film up there, a 16 millimeter that Todd had some connections, and we'd show Renoir either a new film or some classic. And once in a while, we'd ask him to show one of his films. And this is just a wonderful experience. But Norman would drop in occasionally. And so I got to know him. And I was just thinking right before our show, that after Jean died, I went over to see Dito, his widow, and I was struck by how empty the house seemed and how spooky it is. After somebody dies, you may have had that experience that there's this kind of vacuum, you know. And I looked at his chair and I said to Norman, you know, I just felt this amazing absence of Jean. He said, you know, I felt the same way exactly. And I kind of feel that about Norman right now. But he brightened our lives. What a wonderful man. He was very supportive of me. He came to an event for my Spielberg book, which was really nice. I was really surprised that he came to. He was a supportive kind of person. You do meet people like that in the film industry, and he was just a guy who made things happen. Hitchcock got him off the blacklist too. He was blacklisted, and Hitchcock just insisted to the network he needed Norman for his TV show.
Okay, here's a question from Kevin. I enjoyed this talk immensely. You had also gotten to know Jean Renoir. If you had written a definitive biography of Renoir, what would have interested you the most in writing about his life? What would have been the hook that would have interested you most in the way you were interested in Capra's artistic decline after World War II?
Well, thank you for your comments. There I am with Renoir and Dito, and my friend Linda Strawn, who changed her name to Linda Beauvais. Later, she was Todd McCarthy's girlfriend. Todd took this picture. So that shows you the kind of friendly home atmosphere that we used to see with Jean. He was just a wonderful guy in a wheelchair. He couldn't walk anymore, but he dictated 3 novels in his later years to a young guy from UCLA. I thought of doing a biography of Renoir because there wasn't a good one for a long time, or I mean, there were some that were pretty good, but they weren't full enough, you know. But there was a very full French biography by Pascal Marigot that came out about 3 years ago, and I think it's very interesting. It actually is kind of negative in some ways towards Jean. You know, I mean, Jean was not perfect, and he had some political complications in his life that you could criticize and things. But I finally felt I didn't know French well enough, you know, to read all the documents and understand the culture as thoroughly as I wished. And also just logistically, I would have had to move to France. Like, I'd love to write a biography of Stanley Kubrick, who I adore. But to do that, I have to move to London and spend a year going through this gigantic warehouse full of stuff. And I just, you know, at a certain point in your life, you can't do these things anymore. And but with Renoir, I'm glad that somebody did a pretty thorough book, and you can debate parts of it, but it's there. Now with I should say with Lubitsch and Wilder, I kind of extended myself to write about people from other countries, because I'm known as a person who writes about American cinema. But Lubitsch, I just love so much that I wanted to know about his German roots and his German films. And so I thought, well, you know, writing about a different culture is a challenge, but I'll do it. I took the challenge, and I went to Germany, and I hired translators and read all kinds of books about German culture and Jewish history. It helped that I had done the Spielberg book, and I read a lot about Jewish culture and history and religion, et cetera, for that book, and interviewed a lot of Holocaust survivors. And, you know, that was a great experience. That's one of the things that I like about biographies, that like with Spielberg, you write about not just movies, but the Holocaust and dinosaurs and sharks and, you know, one thing or another. And John Ford, you write extensively about World War II, as you did with Capra. And you know, I have many interests. And so with Wilder, it was a natural follow-up to Lubitsch, because they were mentor and protege. But Wilder had a somewhat, you know, the differences between him and Lubitsch are as significant as the similarities. But I went to Germany, and I saw some films there, and I tripped around, and you know, yeah, there's a quote from Goethe. He said, "To understand a poet, you must go onto the poet's land." And I really believe that. And with Spielberg, I had to go to 5 different places, because he had lived in 5 different places. I remember one of the stories that I really enjoyed. His neighborhood in Cincinnati, Avondale, which was a totally Jewish neighborhood in the 40s, is now a black neighborhood. And I went there in the 90s, and I saw a gang of young black guys were kind of standing in the street and kind of looking at me like, what's this guy doing here with a notepad, you know, like what's going on? So I just decided as a reporter, this is my strategy. I just charged over to them and just put my hand out and said, hi, you guys, hey, how you doing? And they said, what are you doing here? And I said, well, you know, I'm writing a book on Steven Spielberg because he grew up right over there at that house. And this guy said, Steven Spielberg came from the hood? And I said, yeah. And so they were really interested in hearing this. It was really interesting. So they were really friendly. And, you know, I love doing that. And that's my old newspaper training. You can charge up to anybody on the street. And if you have an excuse, you can talk to them. And I went in the house where he lived, and the nice lady showed me around. And I said, have you seen his film? She said, oh, just The Color Purple, but I liked it, you know. And, but you learn a lot about the history of each area and the culture. And the synagogue right across the street from their home had become a Baptist church, you know, and I got to talk to the pastor. And I love talking to people of all different backgrounds and denominations and histories. And that's part of my journalistic training. Every day you go to work and you don't know who you're going to talk to, and you talk to all kinds of people, and I can talk to anybody. And I find that really fun. I think I've interviewed, I estimate about 15,000 people in my life. And the two most difficult, number one was Jean-Luc Godard, who's a complete jerk. And number two is John Ford, who was a semi-jerk, I guess you have to say. But a lot of people are really helpful and really nice and welcoming. And but you have to kind of, you know, one thing I learned in the Capra book is I would go to see his old classmates, and they'd sit there and I would be full of questions about Capra, and they'd insist on telling me the story of their lives for half an hour or an hour. And at first I'd get impatient. Then I thought, no, they really want me to know who they are. And then I started finding that really interesting. That's the best part of, you know, I was learning about Los Angeles history and their backgrounds and stuff, and who they were is just wonderful stuff, you know. And that's part of the thrill of writing a biography, is just getting to know the people. But I also love the library research part, you know, digging in old documents. And it's very time consuming, very expensive. You have to stay in a hotel and, you know, airplane travel, blah, blah, blah. But I love going through documents and making discoveries at the National Archives. And part of what you do too is you discover films. I helped discover Welles's The Hearts of Age. I discovered 10 Frank Capra films at the National Archive that nobody knew about, and then they were all released, and I did commentaries for some of them. And I discovered dozens of Ford films at the National Archives that nobody had ever written about. His World War II years, you know, I really went into depth about that. And that's part of your job, is to uncover films as well as history.
Okay, we have another question. In your understanding of artists, what do you make of the visions of Sam Peckinpah, in particular, his treatment of the West compared to Ford? Might his preference for Shane to say the searchers have no small impact on whatever differences Peckinpah and Ford would have from one another?
Well, Shane is my favorite Western, which is a strange thing to say because I'm a John Ford aficionado. I just adore Shane. I love George Stevens, who I think is the most underrated American director. I tried to do a biography of him, but I couldn't sell it. He was a wonderful man. I love George Stevens, and Shane to me is the perfect Western. But I like Peckinpah a lot, although I must say I watched Wild Bunch again recently. I was kind of shocked at like so totally nihilistic this film is. But I mean, it is a brilliantly made film and very dark, and it's kind of like destroying all kinds of Western myths which needed destroying at the time. Tell Them Willie Boy is here by Abraham Polanski. I just showed in my Blacklist class, which is a great film from the same year. And it ends with Robert Redford saying, tell them we're all out of souvenirs. In other words, forget about the myths of the West. Ford, of course, was a myth maker, and he also dissected the myths in The Searchers and Liberty Valance. And Peckinpah, I think, related to that. Peckinpah also celebrated some of the mythology of the Western, like in Ride the High Country. I just watched part of that again, and that's such a beautiful film about Western guys, you know, pioneer type characters. And Marriott Hartley is wonderful. I had a wonderful evening once at the end of the AFI Life Achievement Award show, somehow for Orson Welles. I wound up in a Mexican restaurant in Century City with Ray Bradbury and Sam Peckinpah. I don't know how this happened, and my date. And Peckinpah was drunk out of his mind on tequila. They were old friends. and this mariachi band was serenading the director of the Wild Bunch, you know, and I was chatting with Bradbury because Peckinpah was kind of blotto, and my date was sitting there like really terrified of this guy. And but Peckinpah was being very nice. He was just totally out of his mind. And then at one point he put his head down on the table and passed out, and Bradbury and I just kept talking. Bradbury was a wonderful man. I also tried to do a biography of him and nobody was interested. I mean, can you believe this? I mean, this guy has sold millions of copies of books, but I couldn't sell it. You know, I thought it'd be fun to do a biography of somebody who was not a filmmaker, but you know, you can't always do every book you want to do.
Okay, here is the last question. It's a two-parter. How many books do you read in a week? And do you ever consider to write another autobiography book besides The Broken Places?
Well, I think that memoir is kind of the last stand of the biographer, or the last phase in the life of a biographer, where you start being writing about yourself more. And you know, I was trained back in the day that journalism should be objective. There is no such thing, I soon realized, because that is a cover for defending the status quo, because we all put our biases into the work, and we should try to be honest and fair. But you know, if you're honest, you also realize you come at it from a certain angle and perspective, and you try to expand all that. But you are who you are, and so I started putting myself into the books more. In the Ford book, for example, that's why I call it Searching for John Ford. And I mean, actually, the Capra book, I mean, is an extremely personal book. It doesn't maybe seem like that, but it's just permeated by my viewpoint toward Capra, but it's meticulously researched. Everything is backed up by research and fact, but I have a very strong point of view. I learned that from Robert Caro's book on Johnson, that you need a strong thesis and point of view to organize a good book. And also Justin Kaplan's Mr. Clemens and Mark Twain was a big influence on me. And Strachey's biography of General Gordon. You need a strong point of view on your subject. Otherwise, a lot of biographies are kind of wishy-washy, or you know, they don't have a point of view. They're just a collection of anecdotes or whatever. But I read a lot of books. I have tons of books. And when you're doing a biography, and I'm working on some projects, I'm constantly reading books to find out one thing or another, and buying books on different subjects. And then I try to decompress at the end of the night by reading a book that's not directly related to the subject, so you can clear your mind of the subject. But I'm a voracious reader, and but you know, part of the thing, since we're coming to an end, I'll say one reason I write books is that I want to read the book, and it doesn't exist. My first book was on baseball slang when I was a kid, and I was a baseball fanatic, and I wanted to read a book on baseball slang, but there wasn't one. So I thought, well, hey, I better write that book. So I spent 3 years in high school writing this book, keeping myself out of trouble. And I got it published 17 years later. And that's why I wrote the Welles book, because I couldn't find a good book on Welles to read. And that's the Ford book. I kept thinking, why is there not a really good biography of this America's greatest director? And Frank Capra, how come nobody's ever done a biography of him? And how come they don't tell the truth? Why is there not a biography of Spielberg? So I write the book I want to read, and then you hope that other people will want to read him too. And not enough people do, and I wish more people do. And I'm glad to see all of you here, because you obviously are the kind of people who read books, and we need more of them. But what you want is to find, there's a concept of the ideal reader. You're writing for the unknown reader, the ideal reader. And oddly enough, when I wrote my Ford book, both times I wrote books on Ford, the first with Mike Wilmington was a critical study, and then I wrote my biography, Searching for John Ford. I was convinced, well, Ford was very out of fashion both times, and we helped bring him back into fashion along with some other writers. But when I did the biography, I was convinced nobody's going to read this book. Nobody cared about Ford. I don't know. I was in a strange state of mind. I spent the last 2 years of 30 years of research finishing this. I thought, well, I'll just indulge myself completely, because nobody's going to read this book. What the hell? I'll just write about anything I want to say about Ford. You know, I'll go off on all these, you know, I'll go into great detail on some obscure TV show or something that he worked on. And what I found to my surprise was that book is the one that people come up to me the most and say, I really am glad you wrote that. I love John Ford. Thank you for, this is the book I've been wanting to read on Ford, because there are Ford fanatics out there who want to read all that stuff, and I tapped into their psyches. And I happen to think the Capra book was the one that I value the most because it was the hardest to write and a tremendous struggle. But the Ford book, Ford is a much greater artist than Capra too, and so there's a kind of a warmth and happiness that I had writing that book. And the Spielberg book I wrote as an antidote to Capra because I wanted to write a happier book, because the Capra book, it's very depressing to write a tragic story for 7 years and fight a legal battle. And Spielberg's life was a much happier, fully achieved, satisfying life. And so I really kind of enjoyed the 3 years of doing that. But the fourth thing was a surprise. You never know what people are going to think of your book. And but I really appreciate all of you listening and coming and being supportive, and Catherine and Tess for having me as a guest. It's been awfully nice of you to listen, and hope you read a lot of books, not just mine, but other books by some of the people here. Joe Green is a fantastic writer. Read his books, and other people. But we all should be reading more books, and see movies, but read more books.
Great way to end. I love it. Joe, I can't thank you enough for being here. And thank you everybody for joining us. A couple of upcoming dates. This is our Cinema Arts and Lecture Series. It is free to the public thanks to our donors and sponsors. And just to give you an idea of what's coming up, on June 3rd, we have a master class with Bobette Buster, deconstructing how master films are made. On July 8th, we have Blurring the Lines, Making Documentaries with Janice Engel. And August 12th, HP Mendoza will be joining us to conduct a master class as well. So I hope we'll see you all back here. You're definitely now on our mailing list, so we'll let you know of the upcoming opportunities. And let's all give the snap, silent wave, whatever it is. Joe, thank you so much for being here. It means a lot to have you.
Thank you again, Catherine. You're really a wonderful host, and Tess too, and it's been really nice. And thank you to all the guests. It's been wonderful to talk to all of you.
All right. Well, stay safe out there, everybody. We'll see you at the movies.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.